The morning sun beat down on Grissom Air Reserve Base, baking the cracked tarmac until it shimmered like heat waves on water. The July air was thick, heavy with the scent of jet fuel and kettle corn, and the crowd at the Wings of Valor Air Show was already thousands strong. Children sat atop their parents' shoulders, veterans in faded ball caps shuffled toward the bleachers, and aviation enthusiasts with camera rigs chased every shadow that crossed the sky. No one noticed the old man moving slowly through it all. He wore a faded blue windbreaker and khaki pants stained at the knees. His boots were the kind no one made anymore. Well-worn, army issue, streaked with desert dust that clung stubbornly even after decades. Slung across his shoulder was a battered leather satchel. Its strap, fraying at the seams, bit into his collarbone with every step. His name was Thomas Beckett, age 73. Eyes, brown, sunken, alert beneath brows that hadn't forgotten how to frown. Gait, uneven, with a slight hitch in the right knee, an old injury from a maintenance scaffold collapse back in '86. He walked with purpose, though slowly. The satchel he carried wasn't filled with souvenirs or snacks or programs from the air show. Inside were handwritten schematics, original field manuals, and grease-stained diagrams. Documents he had drafted nearly 50 years ago when he was the U.S. Air Force's chief maintenance engineer for the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, the tank buster, the ugly, unkillable icon of close air support. Back then, no one believed duct tape and scrap aluminum could save a multi-million-dollar aircraft. But Beckett had believed, and he'd proven it, over and over again. Today, he came to watch the ground crew, his people, demonstrate the emergency repair techniques that had once been scrawled in pencil under a bare bulb in a sand-blasted tent in Kuwait. He approached the edge of the VIP enclosure near the maintenance demonstration zone. Young crew members in clean jumpsuits were setting up a simulated wing panel for battle damage repair. Beckett studied them, narrowing his eyes when he saw one. If the techs angle the aluminum patch too steeply, 45 degrees too much, 30 holds better under pressure. 45 rips like paper when the heat comes up. He reached into his satchel, fishing for the page with the original math. He never made it that far. "Excuse me, sir," a voice barked. "This area is restricted." A man in his 30s with sae, gelled hair and mirrored sunglasses stepped between Beckett and the roped-off zone. His black polo bore the airshow logo, and the red lanyard around his neck read, "Security. We need you to step back behind the crowd line," he added. Beckett nodded calmly. "I understand. I just wanted to take a closer look at how they're—" "Sir," the man cut him off, already glancing past Beckett. "It's not safe for civilians. Equipment's live and we've got procedures to follow." Another staffer, tall, younger, clipboard in hand, joined them. "What's the issue here, Brent?" Brent smirked. "Just explaining to this gentleman that this area isn't for sightseeing. Probably someone's granddad who wandered in." The second man laughed, not bothering to hide it. "You know this plane's older than he is, right?" Laughter from nearby. Beckett heard it, didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. He heard it in '74 when he'd brought his first set of field patch ideas to the base commander. He heard it again in '82 when he insisted that a soda can, cut at the right angle, could substitute for a sheared bolt under emergency conditions. He heard it his whole life. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped back and turned away. He made his way to the general spectator area, lined with families, teenagers, lawn chairs, and 100 smartphones raised skyward. He slipped between a cluster of teenagers filming a TikTok and a mother trying to hand her toddler a juice box. No one looked at him. No one offered a seat. He didn't mind. He found a small clearing by the barrier fence and crouched low, his bad knee creaking in protest. Then carefully he pulled out the leather-bound field manual. The cover read, "Modular, Field Repairs, A-10 BDAR, Draft Number 3, T. Beckett, 1976. Inside, yellowing pages covered in meticulous ink lines and block letter notations. He flipped to a page marked with a scrap of ribbon, a full schematic of a wing punctured by a 30mm shell. The same kind of damage that could rip a Warthog out of the sky, if not for a few layers of aluminum patch, bismuth solder, and tape designed to hold under sheer stress at altitude. He traced the lines with his fingers. Not because he needed to, but because they meant something. They were pieces of memory, pieces of survival. Whoa, is that a Sullivan Type 3 patch? The voice beside him was young, curious. He looked up. A woman, early 20s, stood in a grease-streaked jumpsuit. Black hair tied back, hands stained with hydraulic fluid, eyes locked on the manual. "You've seen this?" he asked. "Seen it?" "Sir, we train with it. I'm an A-10 maintainer, airman first class. I thought these were only in digital format. Now, but this," she stepped closer. "Reverend, did you write this?" Beckett gave her a tired smile. "I helped. Long time ago." She blinked. "Wait, you're not Beckett, are you?" The young mechanic's eyes were wide, her mouth half open as if her brain couldn't catch up with what she was seeing. "You're him. You're Thomas Beckett, the Beckett wrap, the spillway clamp mod, the torque limiter bypass. You wrote those." He gave a slow shrug, his voice dry. "Well, I discovered them. Most of the writing came after the test flights didn't explode." She let out a soft breath. "Sir, we still use your procedures. In tech school, our instructors called the Beckett. Wrap the holy duct tape. We patched a hydraulic line with chewing gum in a soda can, just to see if your test still worked. And it did." Beckett didn't quite know how to respond. It had been years since someone looked at him like that, with awe, not pity. Then a gruff voice behind them chimed in. "I'll be damned. I knew that schematic looked familiar." They turned. An older man in a worn leather jacket and a faded cap that read Desert Storm Veteran stepped forward. His walk was stiff, but his eyes were sharp. He studied Beckett for a long second. "You ran maintenance out of Bagram in '91. You were the guy who fixed that 4-hole A-10 with nothing but speed tape and prayers." Beckett raised an eyebrow. "We used a fire extinguisher and dental floss, too." The veteran laughed. "Yeah, that's him." The young mechanic looked like she was about to explode. "Sir, Mr. Beckett, do you know how many people you've helped? My CO said your manual's the reason her jet made it back from Mosul." Beckett blinked. He'd always known the procedures worked, but he'd never heard the stories. He swallowed hard. "I just wanted them to get home," he said quietly. By now, a small group had gathered, whispering, pointing, checking their phones. Someone pulled up an old training video, paused the frame. "Look," one of them said. "This footage, 1979, that's him, that's Beckett, he's wearing the same boots." A murmur rippled outward like a wave. Veterans, young airmen, maintainers, engineers, even a few old crew chiefs, who hadn't touched a wrench in decades. They all moved instinctively toward the man standing quietly at the fence, cradling his ancient notebook like a relic. And then the question came. Why isn't he in VIP? Up above, another A-10 screamed, across the sky. Low, fast, brutal. The crowd cheered, but Thomas barely looked up. He knew the sound by heart. The whine of those twin General Electric turbofans. The specific pitch the Warthog gave off when throttled in a steep climb. He'd helped calibrate those ratios, adjusted the bolt torque values on the nacelle mounts. Back in '78, a nearby screen flashed, Captain James Beckett. A-10 demo pilot Vindicator Squadron. Thomas blinked, his breath caught. James, his grandson. He hadn't known he'd be flying today. They hadn't spoken in months, not since that terse phone call about letting go and the new generation of engineers. Thomas had hung up before James could finish, but there he was, flying the aircraft Thomas had helped keep alive. The same aircraft his manuals had nursed through 5 decades of combat. Beckett felt his chest tighten, not from regret, not quite, but something softer. He looked down at his calloused hands, then back up at the sky. "Does Captain Beckett know you're here?" the Desert Storm vet asked. Thomas shook his head. "He doesn't even know I left the house." The vet was already dialing his phone. "Let's fix that." The crowd around Thomas swelled. The ripple had become a current. Maintenance crews were arriving from the other end of the field. One held up a tablet with an open page from the Beckett BDR archive. Another had a challenge coin with Beckett's initials etched on the edge. One man, a pilot missing part of his left arm, came forward and whispered, "You gave me a way to bring her home." Thomas had no idea what to say. He just stood there, eyes damp, heart full, speechless. Far above, Captain James Beckett was lining up for a combat maneuver when his earpiece crackled. "Vindicator 2, Tower. We've got a situation down in Sector E." "C. Define situation." Your grandfather is apparently on site and, causing a minor scene." "Scene? Yeah. Half the veterans and every maintainer under 30 is surrounding him. Someone says he's the Beckett. He got kicked out of VIP earlier by Brent from security. And now there's talk of a salute formation forming in the general area." James sat frozen. His HUD flickered as he banked into a turn. "Tower, say again, and my grandfather is here?" "Affirmative. And he's become the emotional center of a spontaneous airbase uprising." There was a pause. Then James's voice came back, calm, sharp, cold. "Tower requesting deviation from demo pattern. Requesting personal honor pass, low flyover, Sector C. Call it pilot's discretion." "Vindicator 2, that's not approved. This is for Chief Engineer Thomas Beckett. Clearance or not, I'm making the pass." The roar came first. People looked up, expecting another precision maneuver, another textbook demonstration. But instead of rising for a vertical loop, the A-10 suddenly dipped low, lower than any pilot had dared that day. It banked hard to the E, lift, cutting across the airfield in a sharp diagonal, engines howling like some old war song. The announcer's voice faltered mid-sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, this appears to be an unscheduled maneuver." The crowd murmured, heads turning toward the sector labeled C on their maps, where Thomas Beckett stood, still holding his manual, still looking confused, still surrounded by a growing sea of veterans, mechanics, and stunned onlookers. Inside the cockpit, Captain James Beckett flipped his comms to the PA frequency used for the loudspeakers across the base. His voice echoed, across every loudspeaker, through every grandstand, into every ear. "This is Captain James Beckett, pilot of the A-10 Thunderbolt 2. But today I am speaking not as a pilot, but as a grandson." A hush fell over the field. The man standing near Sector C, the one security turned away earlier, is not just a spectator. He's not just an old man with a notebook. He is Chief Engineer Thomas Beckett, the man who wrote the very maintenance procedures that have kept these aircraft flying for nearly 50 years. The same man who taught me that doing your job quietly, diligently, and with integrity can save more lives than the loudest war cry. Gasps, then stillness. I wouldn't be flying this aircraft if it weren't for his work. Thousands of us wouldn't have made it home if it weren't for his procedures. If you've ever patched a bird in the field, if you've ever relied on BDAR to land safe, you owe him. So today this pass isn't for the crowd, it's not for the cameras, it's for him. The Warthog thundered overhead, just above the minimum safe altitude, and as it passed Sector C, it performed a precise triple wing. Dip left-right level, the missing man formation salute reserved for fallen heroes. Except today, the hero was very much alive. Below, Thomas Beckett stood motionless. Tears slipped silently down his weathered cheeks as he stared up at the aircraft. Roaring above him, his aircraft flown by his grandson, saluting not his death, but his life. Around him, the veterans snapped to attention, saluting in unison. Younger airmen followed. The young mechanic who had first noticed his notebook was sobbing openly now, one hand over her mouth, the other still recording. People who didn't even know who he was. Understood, because this wasn't about recognition. This was about dignity restored. The VIP section turned to chaos. Event organizers scrambled. Brent, the staffer who had dismissed Thomas earlier, froze as his face appeared on the Jumbotron. Replaying the moment he had smirked and waved Grandpa away, the crowd booed, audibly. Meanwhile, base leadership was already on the move. A two-star general, flanked by aides and security, made a beeline across the tarmac toward Sector C. "Chief Beckett," the general said, reaching him in a rush of wind and awe. On behalf of this base, this service, and every maintainer in uniform, I'm sorry. Thomas looked up, startled. Sir? You should never have been turned away, the general said. Would you allow me to escort you back to VIP? Your grandson will be landing shortly. And I believe there are several thousand people here who'd like the chance to thank you properly. Thomas blinked again. It didn't feel real. He looked around, the saluting veterans, the young crew chief wiping his eyes, the trembling mechanic, still holding his manual like scripture. Yes, he said finally quietly. I think that would be all right. As they made their way toward the VIP section, Brent stepped forward, pale and sweating. General, I didn't realize who he was. He didn't identify himself. The general cut him off cold. He shouldn't have had to. Brent flinched. Every person at this show deserves respect, the general continued. But you dismissed a veteran, a legend, because of how he looked. Because of your assumptions. That tells me you're in the wrong job. The general turned to his aide. Escort Mr. Brent off base. He's done here. Brent tried to stammer an apology, but it was drowned out by the cheers erupting behind them. Thomas didn't turn to look. He wasn't interested in vengeance. He was walking into something greater than that. At the VIP line, the ropes were removed. People stood aside. The maintenance crews, those same teams who had been setting up for their live demo, stood in formation as Thomas approached. One of them, a sergeant with grease under his nails, stepped forward and saluted sharply. Sir, we're using your BDAR procedures for today's demo. Would you honor us by supervising? Thomas's lips trembled. I'd be honored, he said softly, though I suspect you all know them better than I do by now. And then, he looked up. The A-10 was circling back for landing. His grandson was returning. And for the first time in decades, Thomas Beckett was about to stand next to the warbird he'd kept flying for 50 years, not as a ghost from the past, but as a living legend. The A-10 touched down in a low, steady landing, its rugged wheels kissing the tarmac like a bird coming home. Even before it came to a full stop, a ripple of anticipation rolled through the crowd. All eyes were on the canopy. The announcer, normally composed and chipper, could barely find his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing something extraordinary today. Captain James Beckett is returning from an unscheduled flyover, a tribute to his grandfather, Chief Engineer Thomas Beckett, whose lifetime of maintenance innovations have helped keep these aircraft and their crews safe for nearly 50 years. We honestly didn't know he was among us today. The canopy hissed open. James Beckett unstrapped himself in record time. He didn't salute. He didn't wave. He just climbed down the ladder and broke into a sprint. Across the tarmac, through the VIP cordon, past the crew chief standing at attention, straight into the arms of the man who had once taught him how to tell the difference between a bolt that was tight and a bolt that was right. Grandpa, James choked. I'm sorry. Thomas Beckett was still holding the manual when his grandson wrapped him in a fierce embrace. For what? He asked gently. For not calling. For not knowing you were here. For letting you stand behind a rope line when you should have been. Leading the demo. For all of it. Thomas pulled back just enough to see James's face. You flew a perfect pass. I broke the pattern and disobeyed the tower, James said. Thomas smiled faintly. Some rules are meant to be bent, others rewritten. They both laughed softly, the tension of their months-long silence dissolving between them. Nearby, the field crew had paused their setup. Every mechanic and pilot in the area was watching the scene. Then, from somewhere near the front of the VIP, "Risers," a quiet voice rose. "Sir, would you speak to us?" It was the young mechanic from earlier, the one who'd recognized his manual. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her phone to her chest, still recording. Beckett looked to the base commander, who gave a nod. "We've set up a mic, sir, if you're willing." For a moment, Thomas didn't move. He glanced at the microphone stand a few paces away. His hands were still shaking slightly. Then he looked at James, who gave the smallest of nods. It's time. He stepped up to the mic. The crowd quieted. Phones were raised. The wind tugged at his windbreaker, revealing a patch underneath. U.S. Air Force, Field Engineer. Ritat Thomas looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, male and female, decorated and fresh out of tech school. Then he cleared his throat. When I started working on the A-10 program in 1973, I didn't set out to be remembered. His voice was gravelly but strong. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't chasing rank or medals. I just knew pilots were dying because their planes couldn't get patched fast enough. So I figured, if I could keep one aircraft flying, maybe I could keep one kid from not coming home. A hush fell across the tarmac. The procedures I wrote, the ones some of you still use, weren't meant to be revolutionary. They were meant to be reliable. They were meant for desperate people in desperate situations who needed answers, not theories. They were meant to be simple, because war is complicated enough. He paused. But I also didn't speak up when I should have. A breeze rustled the flags beside him. I let others take credit. I let people believe I was just another pair of hands, another name in the logs. I didn't demand a seat in the briefing rooms. I stayed quiet because I thought the work would speak for itself. His voice dropped just slightly. And maybe it did, but silence has a cost. The crowd listened still. It cost me time with my family. It cost me moments I'll never get back. And today I was reminded that silence can also cost others. When we don't speak out, when we don't stand up, when we let people be dismissed because they're older, quieter, or look like they no longer belong. He looked up again, locking eyes with the young mechanics near the stage. You do belong. Whether you've served 1 year or 30, whether you're a fresh recruit or a gray-haired ghost like me, if you do the work, you belong. A few people began to clap, then more, then thunderously, as if an entire generation had been waiting for this man to finally raise his voice. From the risers to the runway, from the tech tents to the family bleachers, the crowd rose to their feet. Backstage, the general turned to his aide. "Get him whatever he needs," he said. "If he wants a hangar, he gets one. If he wants to teach, we'll build a damn classroom around him." The aide nodded. "And if he doesn't want anything?" The general smiled. "Then we listen harder." And Thomas Beckett, who once patched an A-10 in the middle of a monsoon with a wrench, a prayer, and a patch made from a broken field radio. Antenna stood straighter than he had in years. He had spoken, and the world had heard him. The maintenance bay smelled like metal and memory. Less than an hour after his speech, Thomas Beckett stood in a fresh Flightline coverall, its fabric stiff, creases still crisp. A name patch was hastily sewn onto the chest. Beckett. Just like it had been, all those years ago. But this time, everyone knew what that name meant. Around him, a half-dozen young maintainers gathered like disciples. Grease under fingernails, tablets in hand, tension in every breath. They had grown up hearing about the Beckett rap in manuals as a bullet point in training quizzes. Now the man who'd invented it stood in front of them, quiet, solid, precise. An A-10 waited behind them, propped on jacks. A mock hydraulic puncture had been prepped for the public demo. The pressure test hoses had been connected. The modular panel had been removed. Now came the part everyone feared most, the patch, and Thomas Beckett just nodded. "Show me what you've got," he said. The youngest tech stepped forward, fumbling with a set of aluminum shears. Angle of application should be 45 degrees. "Stop," Beckett interrupted gently. "Don't just say what you were told, tell me why." The tech froze, looked down, then shook her head. "Because that's what the handbook said." Beckett raised one eyebrow. No anger, just curiosity. "And do you think it's correct?" The girl hesitated. I guess it is?" Thomas turned to the others. "If you don't know why you're doing something, you're not fixing the aircraft. You're following a ritual." He picked up the aluminum patch himself, held it in. The light turned it slightly. 30 degrees, anything steeper and under strain, it tears. Shallower, and it won't bind against the wing's tension arc. We figured it out after 2 failures during heat stress tests. Lost 2 planes before we corrected it. Never lost another one after. A beat of silence. Then the youngest tech stepped forward again, her hands steadier this time. Can I try it again with 30? Beckett smiled. Now you're learning. An hour later, the public demonstration began. Thousands watched from the bleachers, from behind the fence, from screens on the base. But Thomas didn't. Look at the crowd. He was focused on the tools, the technique, the rhythm of it all. The torque wrench in his hand felt like home. His fingers, though slower now, moved with memory, not hesitation. Torque it to 25, not a pound more. Yes, sir. Check the temperature of the patch adhesive. Your sealant's no good if it cures too fast. Copy that. He worked beside them, not above them. Not as a guest of honor, but as a crewmate. One of them. Grease on his sleeve, sweat on his brow. After the final seal was placed and pressure tested, a red light turned green. Applause erupted again, but Thomas barely heard it. He was too busy checking the angles. Not because he didn't trust the team, because he wanted them to trust themselves. Back under the hangar shade, the base commander returned with 2 folders tucked beneath one arm. Chief Beckett, he said, addressing him now with full rank and respect. I have something for you. Thomas glanced. You already gave me a uniform. This isn't from me, this is from the Pentagon. He handed over the first folder. Inside, a letter signed by the Secretary of the Air Force, authorizing the formation of a new initiative, the Beckett Field Innovation Program, a force-wide effort to gather, document, and develop grassroots maintenance solutions across all aircraft platforms, based on Thomas Beckett's model of field expedient innovation, under his leadership. They want you to teach what you know, the general said, to lead a generation of mechanics who think with their hands and their heads. You'd have a team, a staff, a hangar, your own lab, whatever you need. Thomas didn't speak. He just stared at the letter. They'll listen now, the general added, because you spoke. Thomas looked over at the young tech still buzzing from the demonstration. Martinez, the youngest, was already scribbling down notes he hadn't. Even said aloud, "When would I start?" "We've already cleared a building." He turned to see James standing nearby, arms crossed, grinning with something deeper than pride. Relief. "Told you this generation still needed you," his grandson said. Thomas chuckled softly. "I guess there's some work left to do after." "Do all." Later that afternoon, he sat alone for a moment on a maintenance cart, hands black with grease, uniform damp with heat. Around him, notebooks, tools, diagrams drawn on the back of napkins, and a dozen young airmen watching him like he held the keys to a treasure chest, which in a way he did. "You okay, Grandpa?" James asked, crouching beside him. Thomas nodded slowly. "I thought I'd been forgotten, that the system just took my work and absorbed it." He looked at the warthog on the tarmac, catching the gold glint of a sunset against its skin. "But maybe the point isn't being remembered," he added. "Maybe it's the work itself, that it keeps going." Just then, Martinez approached with a group of maintainers. "Chief Beckett, would you consider doing a workshop?" Thomas blinked. "A workshop?" "Not just on the procedures," she said, "but how you invented them, how you figured them out under fire. We need to learn how to think like that, not just what to copy." Beckett considered this. "I'm 73 years old, and you're still sharper than anyone I've met," Martinez said. "With respect, sir, innovation doesn't have an expiration date." Thomas Beckett smiled, really smiled. "All right," he said, "bring a wrench and no laptops." The workshop was standing room only. It wasn't held in a classroom or a lecture hall, but in Hangar 18, one of the oldest buildings on the base. The concrete walls still bore the scuff marks of decades of maintenance work. Patches of oil stained the floor like forgotten ghosts, but the air buzzed with something new. More than 60 airmen, men, women, recruits, veterans, had gathered. Some sat cross-legged on the floor. Others leaned against tool chests or stood, quietly near the hydraulic lift. All eyes faced one direction. At the front of the room stood Thomas Beckett, chalk in one hand, a blank maintenance board behind him. No projector, no PowerPoint, just a piece of chalk. Just like he'd done in the early years. "We're not here to memorize," he said, writing the word "think" in block letters behind him. "We're here to understand, because combat doesn't care about checklists. Combat asks you, can you figure it out when everything's broken, burning, or falling apart?" There were nods. Some took notes. Others just listened, soaking it in. He began the first scenario. "You're 300 miles from the nearest base. Your bird takes 2 rounds through the left wing, 1 near the actuator. You've lost pressure in your reserve hydraulics. All you've got is a field kit, some tools, and a kid looking at you like you're the last person standing between him and the enemy." He turned. "What do you do?" A silence, then a voice from the back. "Sir, can you redirect the pressure using a bypass feed?" "Good. And what do you use to seal the bleed?" "We, patch with reinforced tape?" Beckett gave a nod. "And what angle do you lay the patch?" 30 degrees, half the room said in unison. He smiled. Now we're getting somewhere. After an hour, they were deep into case studies. Beckett walking them through real war stories like puzzles, letting them fail first, then showing them how the solution had been found using only what was on hand. "Improvisation is fine," he said, "but what saves lives is repeatable improvisation. Figure it out once, document it, teach it. That's what innovation means." Martinez was scribbling notes faster than her hand could keep up. James, standing near the door, beamed like he'd never been prouder in his life. Then, the door opened, and a figure stepped inside. Brent. No black polo, no VIP lanyard. Just simple, civilian clothes and a subdued look in his eyes. He stood quietly near the back, said nothing. Beckett saw him, paused for half a second, then continued the lesson. When it ended, the crowd erupted in applause, loud, grateful, sustained. As the room began to disperse, some came up to shake Beckett's hand. Others just nodded quietly, reverently, like mechanics at a cathedral. But Brent remained in the corner, still, watching. Finally, when the crowd had thinned, he stepped forward. "Chief Beckett," he said quietly. Thomas looked up. "I owe you an apology." A few airmen turned. Conversations faded. Brent took a slow breath. "Not just for what I said, or how I treated you, but for how I thought." He glanced at Martinez, then back at Beckett. "I used to think experience had an expiration date. That wisdom looked like clean uniforms and polished resumes. That old meant irrelevant. That quiet meant confused. I was wrong." Thomas didn't answer. He just listened. "I spent the last few weeks thinking about that day, watching your speech, reading about what you built, and then I heard about this workshop." He reached into his bag and pulled out a spiral notebook, worn, marked, full of scribbles. "So I came to learn." Beckett studied him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he gestured toward a folding chair. "Then have a seat, Mr. Brent." A few heads turned in surprise. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow," Beckett added. "The difference is what they do next." Brent sat down. The others moved aside, and just like that, the man who once dismissed a legend had become a student of the very legacy he tried to ignore. That evening, long after the workshop ended, Thomas Beckett walked the perimeter of the hangar alone. The stars were beginning to show. The wind was cooler now. Somewhere in the far distance, a warthog roared to life again. He smiled to himself, because he knew something now, deep in his bones. This wasn't a farewell tour. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't even redemption. It was a beginning, and he still had work to do. The hearing chamber smelled of wood polish and cold air conditioning, one of those rooms where history always felt like it was either being made or politely ignored. Thomas Beckett sat alone at a long oak table. Behind him, rows of congressional, aides, cameras, and representatives from every branch of the armed forces. A few wore ribbons, others cufflinks. All of them had been briefed, but none of them truly understood. Not yet. The placard in front of him read simply, Chief Engineer, Ret. Thomas Beckett, testifying before the Subcommittee on Defense Readiness and Maintenance Reform. He adjusted his collar. His grandson James sat behind him, just off camera, flanked by Martinez and two young maintainers from the workshop. One clutched the Beckett manual like a lifeline. At the front of the chamber, the committee chair, a congresswoman in a dark green suit, leaned forward. Mr. Beckett, thank you for being here. You've been requested to share your perspective on field-level innovation, maintenance procedures, and the integration of legacy expertise into modern readiness strategies. She paused. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to begin with a more personal question. Thomas met her gaze. Ma'am, why now? Why speak up after all these years? He breathed in, held it, exhaled slowly. Because silence doesn't protect anyone. He adjusted the microphone, leaned slightly forward, and began. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with the deliberate cadence of a man who had lived every word he was about to say. When I first submitted a battlefield repair protocol for review, it was dismissed as unorthodox. I was told patching a pressurized fuel line with layered aluminum and synthetic tape was reckless, that it wouldn't last. It lasted 6 hours longer than the aircraft needed to get home, and it saved a pilot's life. A pause. When I refined that method, I wasn't allowed to present it to command. My CO gave the credit to someone else, a junior officer with a better haircut and a louder voice. He glanced up at the room. I didn't fight it. I thought, the work will speak for itself. I was wrong. Because for 20 years, the procedures I helped pioneer were treated like rumors, passed between squadrons, whispered about in hangars, rarely credited, never formally adopted until enough aircraft got patched, using them to prove they worked. He looked directly at the chairwoman now. And in those years, we lost aircraft we could have saved. We lost airmen who might have made it home, not because we didn't have the tools, but because we didn't listen. The room was silent now. Even the aides had stopped typing. The military invests billions in platforms, in software, in futuristic concepts, but too often, it forgets the humans holding the wrench, the ones inventing solutions in real time, under real fire. He tapped the notebook in front of him, the original Beckett manual. This, I wrote in the dirt, in mess tents, in the back of a Humvee between incoming fire and generator failures. Not for glory, not for publication, but because I had to. He paused, voice steady. I am not special, I was just there, I was quiet, but I paid attention. Another pause. The room leaned in. And now that you've asked me here, what I need to tell you is this. There are more like me, thousands, retired, ignored, buried under paperwork or faded out of the system. Veterans and field engineers with solutions we never asked them to share. You want innovation? Start with them. Before you fund another prototype that can't land in a sandstorm, go find the woman who figured out how to fix a torque actuator. With dental floss and a helmet strap, she's out there. The chairwoman nodded slowly. Another representative cleared his throat and leaned forward. Chief Beckett, if given authority, what would you do to change that? Thomas smiled, gently. Give a damn about the quiet ones. Then more seriously, set up regional hubs where veterans and active duty maintainers co-design procedures together, create field innovation fellowships, pay people to listen to maintainers, not just engineers in DC. And whatever you do, don't wait until they go viral to believe them. Laughter rippled, quiet but sharp. Martinez behind him wiped her eyes. 2 hours later, the testimony ended. Outside the chamber, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. Thomas didn't answer. He simply walked down the steps and into the sunlight, a little slower than he used to, but taller than ever before. That night, he sat on the balcony of his hotel, notebook open, watching planes blink overhead. James sat beside him. You just rewrote half the maintenance doctrine in one afternoon. Thomas chuckled. They won't do anything unless someone actually gets to work. James turned. Then I hope you're ready, old man. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Ready? For what? To build the damn thing. They approved the Beckett Initiative, full funding, full authority. They want your first regional hub live in 6 months. Guess who's been named its director? Thomas stared at him. You're kidding. James just grinned. Congratulations, Grandpa. You're officially the most dangerous man in maintenance again. And in that moment, under the quiet glow of aircraft lights crossing the sky, Thomas Beckett laughed, truly laughed for the first time in years, because the silence was over, and the work was just beginning. The old hangar hadn't changed much. Peeled paint still flaked from the ceiling. A rusted ladder still leaned against the east wall. The same cracked window, fourth from the left, still whistled when the wind was just right. But something else had changed. A banner now hung above the main entrance. The Beckett Field Innovation Hub. Site 01. Think first. Wrench second. Thomas Beckett stood beneath it, coveralls tied at the waist, arms crossed, eyes scanning every beam and bolt, as if seeing the ghosts of every late-night shift he'd ever worked. This was where he had first tested the tape and bolt method, where he'd taught his first apprentice, where a 20-something field engineer had once been told he wasn't officer material, and where he'd stayed anyway, building something better than rank, reliability. And now, the place that had once ignored him bore his name. Inside, the team was already assembling. Martinez had been promoted, unofficially at least. She now coordinated daily operations and scheduled innovation sessions with rotating mechanics from across all service branches. Young, focused, relentless. Today was the soft launch. No cameras, no generals, just the real people who did the work. Thomas ran a hand across the top of a workbench that had once held an entire Warthog's hydraulic manifold. Sir, Martinez said, walking over. Today's session is a big one. Cross-service, Navy, Air Force, Marines, even a guy from the Canadian Forces. You want me to intro? Thomas shook his head. I got it. He stepped up to the makeshift whiteboard and tapped it once with a marker. The room quieted. I'm not here to teach you what I did, he began. I'm here to help you figure out what you can do. Every patch I ever made started with a mistake. Sometimes mine, sometimes the machine's, but always in the field, always with time ticking and no manual for the thing that had just gone wrong. So today I'm giving you a broken part. No solution, no instructions, just the failure. Your job is to figure out how to bring it back. Hands went up. A few skeptical looks. Beckett smiled. Innovation doesn't begin with knowledge, it begins with a question. The team got to work, and Thomas watched, not as a leader, not even as a teacher, but as a witness to the spark he once carried, now lit in others. For a while he simply observed, jotted notes, asked quiet questions. But then, just before noon, something unusual happened. A delivery truck rolled up outside. A civilian stepped down from the cab holding a clipboard. Behind him, a large object was carefully lowered from the bed, a covered frame on a metal pallet. Martinez looked puzzled. We didn't order any equipment this week, the driver pointed. This delivery is for Chief Beckett directly. Special handling, from Wright-Patterson Archives. Thomas walked over slowly, recognizing the inventory label almost instantly. USAF Tech Ref 1974 A10. Obsolete, do not destroy. His pulse skipped. He lifted the tarp. Underneath, carefully, mounted, was a section of an A-10's portside wing, complete with patchwork. His patchwork. The original test unit from his first field demonstration. Still holding. Still intact. A handwritten note was taped to the side. We found this buried in the archive crates. Thought it belonged somewhere it could still teach. Lieutenant Col E. Sharp. Bilmy Wright Pat Technical Museum Division. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't have to. His hand moved gently across the jagged aluminum and faded sealant like someone greeting an old friend. That evening, after the last student left and the hangar lights dimmed to half power, Thomas stayed behind. Martinez brought him coffee in a chipped mug. "That patch from today," she said softly. "The one you made 40 years ago. It still held." Thomas nodded. They always did. People just didn't believe them. They do now. A quiet hung between them. Then she added, "You know, sir, you didn't just patch aircraft, you patched belief. You made it okay to trust quiet ideas." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I just didn't want to see another bird grounded. For a busted valve we could have fixed with a tin can and a good eye." Just as she turned to leave, another figure entered the hangar. An older woman, civilian clothes, silver hair tied back. Her walk was slow, deliberate. Beckett looked up and froze. "Lillian?" She smiled gently. "You didn't think I'd let this whole thing happen without saying hello, did you?" Lillian Rourke, his former colleague, the co-author of the first 3 field protocols, the one person who had believed in his patchwork before anyone else, and had left the Air Force after being passed over for promotion too many times. "I heard you finally found your voice," she said. "Took long enough." "Well," she grinned, "I've still got my copy of the patch book and a few improvements of my own." Thomas laughed. "You came to join the workshop?" She nodded. "You've got the Beckett hub now, but maybe it's time for the Rourke Annex." And just like that, the man who had once stood behind the crowd was now surrounded by old allies, young innovators, and a future that was finally listening. And at the heart of it all, a patched-up piece of wing, a chalkboard, and a man who never stopped fixing what others said was beyond repair. The lecture hall at the Air Force Academy wasn't ready for what was about to happen. The cadets had been told it was just another guest speaker, a retired engineer who'd made some famous maintenance manual. Most didn't know the name. A few thought he might be the guy who fixed jets in Vietnam or something. No one was expecting a war hero or a viral legend. They weren't expecting Thomas Beckett. When he stepped onto the stage, alone, with a chalk stick in one hand and a grease-stained notebook in the other, a few students whispered. Some recognized the face from the video. Others were just curious why a man in coveralls was standing where generals usually stood. He didn't bother with introductions. He just tapped the microphone once, then said, "I'm not here to talk about procedures, I'm here to talk about a mistake." Silence. Total attention. He set the notebook down, letting it rest beside him like an old friend. "In 1983, I supervised a maintenance team in Kuwait. We were in a temporary hangar. Sandstorm had just blown through and the power was out. One of my junior techs, 21 years old, misread a pressure valve reading during a repair. He patched a hydraulic line without checking the backup system." He paused. His voice was calm, unflinching. "That aircraft lifted off the next morning and lost hydraulic pressure 10 minutes later. It made it home barely, but the pilot dislocated both shoulders trying to land it manually. It was my responsibility. I signed off on the repair." Another pause. "So I spent that night rewriting every procedure, every test, every checklist. Not because I was told to, but because someone had to think differently." He took a breath. "That pilot? He walked again, flew again, but I never forgot the look in his eyes when he got out of that cockpit. He didn't ask if the storm caused it. He didn't ask if the valve was faulty. He asked, who trained? That mechanic?" Thomas looked out across the rows of cadets, their uniforms crisp, their notebooks blank. "Some of you will lead flight teams. Some will fly, some will design. And some of you will never get a thank you in your entire career. But you will make a choice, every day, to do it by the book or to understand what the book forgot. There is no glory in maintenance, no parade, no movie deal. But every time a plane lands safely because of something you noticed, some crack, some sound, some instinct, you become the difference between survival and silence. That is your mission." One cadet raised her hand. "Sir, if you had the chance to relive your career, would you do anything differently?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'd speak up sooner." He let that hang in the air. "I thought silence was professionalism. That humility meant invisibility. But the truth is, a good idea dies if you never say it out loud. And worse, someone else might pay for your silence. Another cadet raised his voice. "Sir, what's the one thing we should remember years from now when we're in the field?" Thomas stared at him, then stepped away from the mic and picked up a piece of chalk. He wrote 5 words on the board behind him. "The work must survive you." Then circled it. Because if the work dies when you leave, then you weren't building something, you were renting it. When he stepped down from the stage, the room remained silent. No applause. Not at first, just processing. Deep, sobering, stillness. Then one cadet stood, saluted, then another and another. And soon the entire hall stood, back straight, chins lifted, hands raised. Not for a speech, not for a guest, but for a legacy. Outside, Thomas stood by the railing overlooking the campus airfield. James joined him. "I didn't know about the pilot in '83, James said quietly. "You weren't supposed to," Thomas replied. "We fixed the problem. That's what mattered. But you still carry it. Every day." A pause. "You think they understood what you meant in there?" James asked. Thomas nodded. "They will, one day, when something goes wrong, when no one's around, when the checklist doesn't cover it. They'll hear that voice in their head. The work must survive you, and they'll do the right thing." Back at the Beckett hub that evening, the entire team had gathered around a whiteboard. On it, someone had written, "What are you building that will outlive you?" Underneath it, dozens of sticky notes, ideas, innovations, drawings, questions, signatures. And at the very center, Martinez's note, written in block letters, "I don't want credit, I want continuity." Thomas saw it, read it, smiled. "That's how you know it's working," he said. The sun was setting over Grissom Air Reserve Base. The sky had turned gold and soft lavender, casting long shadows across the hangars and runways. Far in the distance, the familiar silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, weathered but proud, taxied back into its bay after a late training flight. Inside Hangar 18, everything was quiet. The Beckett hub had officially closed for the evening. Tools had been racked, whiteboards wiped. Laughter still echoed faintly from the break room, where Martinez and a few airmen played cards over coffee. But Thomas had stayed behind, alone at the old maintenance cart where it had all begun. His satchel sat beside him. So did the first schematic he had ever drawn, still stained with grease, corners curled, edges faded, but intact. He didn't look tired. He looked full, like a man who had finally handed something off after holding it too long. James walked in, holding 2 mugs. "You forget how to leave a hangar, old man." Thomas chuckled softly. "Just making sure it's still here in the morning." "It will be, because of you." Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the sunset stretch across the concrete floor like golden tape. "You know," he said slowly, "I used to wonder what legacy meant. I thought maybe it was about being remembered, or being quoted, or having your name in a manual." He shook his head. "But it's not. Legacy is what someone does when they think no one's watching, because you taught them the right way to care." He looked up at James, his voice softer now. "You cared, they all did. That's the legacy." For a while, they sat in silence. No need to fill it. And then, from outside the hangar doors, the sound of footsteps, rapid, purposeful. Martinez appeared, slightly out of breath, holding her tablet. "Sorry to bother you both, but we just got a message from Air Mobility Command." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "They're implementing your modular wing joint retrofit, fleet-wide." Martinez grinned. "Effective immediately. Standard protocol. Beckett-Rourke model." Thomas blinked. "Fleet-wide?" She nodded. "Sir, you just changed how every A-10 gets built going forward." For the first time in a very long time, Thomas Beckett leaned back and allowed himself to take it in. Not pride, not glory, but peace, a feeling like it landed, it lasted, it lived. Later that night, after the lights were dimmed and the hub went quiet, Thomas walked one last lap around the hangar. He paused at the door, turned back, looked once more at the tables, the oil-stained floor, the students' scribbles, still faintly etched in chalk. Then he picked up a piece of white tape from the edge of the workbench and stuck it gently on the door frame. 5 words: "You belong here. TB." 2 months later, the Beckett Hub had expanded into 3 states. 6 months later, the Sullivan Rourke Beckett Engineering Fellowship was launched to find and fund maintainers with untapped ideas. 1 year later, an A-10 limped home from a desert mission, its wing held together by the Beckett patch method, applied by a 20-year-old crew chief who had never met Thomas in person, but had learned from his workshop videos. That aircraft landed, and the pilot survived. And the crew chief, tears in. Her eyes whispered, "Thank you, old man." Thomas Beckett passed away 5 years later, quietly in his sleep. No speeches, no ceremony, just a wrench still on his workbench, a notebook half full of ideas, and a plaque near his cot that read, "The work must survive you." And it did. Epilogue somewhere. In a hangar long after sunset, a young airman tapes a cracked access panel. Not because it's protocol, not because it's ordered, but because she knows. Somewhere, someone is depending on her to get it right, and on her desk sits a manual with grease stains on the cover. Inside the first page it reads, "Don't do it for credit. Do it so the next one makes it home." Chief Thomas Beckett. She closes the book, gets to work, and the silence is enough. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who believes in quiet strength, lasting work, and second chances. Sometimes the ones who go unnoticed leave the biggest legacy.